It's another Mego Star Trek Sunday, and this week I'm going to turn my attention to a couple of figures that were released much earlier in the year, and they are the Commander Riker and Jordy La Forge figures. Now, because they were released much earlier in the year, of course they don't benefit from the new body molds and enhanced articulation as we've seen with some of the more recent videos looking at these Mego Star Trek figures. And these are both mass market release figures, so you should be able to pick them up pretty much anywhere. So without further ado, let's start off by taking a look at the Commander Riker figure. I'm a huge fan of Riker. I've always really liked this character, so I was really glad to finally have him represented in Mego form. And this release does mark his debut in this scale and in this line. We've not had a Commander Riker figure before in the Mego line, so this is pretty exciting stuff. Now, if you've seen any of my previous Mego Star Trek videos, you will know that I'm not a huge fan of this packaging. I always complain about it because it is so simple and it is so generic, and it is always the same with every release. Obviously, it's quite bland. We have that blue background, we have the grayed out image of the United Federations of Planets logo, which is quite nice, and then we have the image in the top left hand corner of whoever the captain is of that series. So in this case it is Captain Picard, of course, but other than that it's quite bland, and there's not really a lot to differentiate this or make this feel distinctive from any other release in this line. But conversely, I do like the back packaging design. I always really like when they use an actual image or a promotional image such as this one on the packaging. I think this looks really cool. It's blown up to a nice big size and it's pretty displayable and quite fun. And for the most part, it's pretty clean from text as well, so it's quite visually striking. So moving on to the figure himself, and I think the first thing you're going to notice about this figure is the costume, because this is one of the first releases since the first wave where we had Picard and Data in the line initially, and it's a very different approach they've taken to this costume. But first, if we start off by taking a look at their head sculpt, we can see obviously this is a brand new head sculpt. We've not had a Riker in this line before. And for the most part, I think the likeness is pretty good. There's definitely a resemblance there of the actor Jonathan Frakes. I think it's quite close in some ways, and yet there's something about it that leaves me a little bit cold. It doesn't feel quite right, and I think it might be to do with the way the beard is painted on. It looks a little bit maybe too watery and a bit too ill-defined for my liking, because I do think in terms of how they've done the eyes and the nose, that looks pretty accurate. So I think this is a pretty decent attempt. I don't think it's nailed it by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's a pretty solid likeness all in all. And as I say, the major change to the costume is really appreciated. The costume now seems to be a lot tighter, the material seems to be a little bit thicker, though that might just be my imagination. But I think the huge innovation here is the fact that they've now added a plastic Communicator badge on their uniform. So this is an external piece, it's stuck on, it's pretty solid, and it just gives it an extra texture and it just looks more authentic, much better than the approach they took with the Picard or the Data figure, where it was kind of dyed into the costume and it just looked really out of proportion and it looked pretty awful in truth. I really like this approach and just elevates the figure in my opinion. Both of these figures of course have the standard Mego hands, which are perfectly fine and functional. They've lasted us all these years, but they have of course been massively improved in my opinion by the more recent moulds that we've seen. The trouser legs are pretty much identical to what we saw with the Captain Picard and Data figures. They do lift up, and of course we can see underneath there that they've used the classic Star Trek boot. Now I'll run through the articulation scheme just once, because of course the articulation is the same on both figures. It is the standard Mego articulation, it's not the new and improved articulation. So there is a swivel at the head so he can turn his head right the way around. He's got that joint at the shoulders which are connected to elastic bands, so when you do try to move the shoulder joint it does feel like you're kind of dislocating the shoulder and the arm does feel a little bit loose. There is a single joint at the elbow allowing the lower arm to bend to 90 degrees. There's a pin swivel at the wrist allowing that wrist to rotate 360 degrees, and of course it will hinge forwards and backwards as well. And then there is a ball joint in the waist which will allow the figure to bend from side to side, forwards, backwards, and move from side to side. The legs kick out at the hips to the side, they kick forwards, and they kick backwards as well, which is great. There's another single joint at the knee that allows the lower leg to bend to 90 degrees. Both figures come with the same accessory, and that is the phaser. I'm not a huge fan of this phaser mold. It's just a little bit too big and out of proportion for my liking. And although there's some attempt to put some detailing on the phaser itself, there's no paint apps here to really capitalise on it, so it looks a little bland and a bit clumsy to me. Now as you can see, the older hand molds can hold these phasers, will be fairly tight in their grip, but it does look quite clunky and really unsophisticated. It never looks quite right. It never looks like they're really ready to fire the phaser. It just kind of looks like this big giant prop in their hands, which yeah, it doesn't look great. Okay, so next up we have the Jordy La Forge. Now in terms of the packaging, there's nothing really new for me to say here. You know my thoughts on this by now. But on the reverse of the packaging, you can see they're taking a slightly different approach to Jordy La Forge. We can see here that they've gone for a sort of illustrated image of this character, which may be using some reference materials that's been digitized. I'm not quite sure, but it doesn't look quite right. Certainly the body definitely looks like it's been painted. I don't particularly mind this approach. It's definitely not my preference. I'd much rather have what we had with the Riker there, an actual production still from the series, which has been brilliant. And it'd be nice to keep that consistent across this line, especially when you want to put them on display. You want these figures to look like they're part of a set, and it does feel like their approach is a little bit haphazard, a little bit random almost, because you never quite know what you're going to get here. But nevertheless, this isn't bad. I still think this is pretty presentable. It just would have been nice for it to line up and be very similar to some of the others. Now, this figure also marks Jordy's debut in the Mego line, so again, another highly anticipated character. Really fantastic to see that the crew is being filled out a lot more now. We've got some of the real key members of the bridge crew, which is fantastic. Once again, we have a brand new head sculpt, and I think, yeah, the likeness is pretty decent. It's a little soft, sure, there's not a lot of detailing here, but I think it does the job pretty well, and I do think they've done a really nice job of the visor in particular. Definitely the gold trim there looks a bit metallic, which is a nice touch, and it just adds a little bit of colour, which is very much appreciated. So I think this looks pretty good all in all. Jordy also benefits from the same approach they took with the Riker. He has a much nicer costume than, say, the Data had in the previous wave. The costume just seems a little bit tighter, it just seems a little bit more correct in terms of its proportions, and I really like that comm badge, as I've said before. I really like this approach. I think it works really well. One thing I didn't mention with the Riker is the collar. I really like this approach to the collar as well. Now, it's not really very accurate because it's a lot chunkier, a lot puffier than it is on the show, of course, but I think somehow it works really nicely, and I'm not quite sure why, but I do really like this. I also like the approach they've taken to actually dotting in the insignia, the rank there. I think that works pretty well. Other than that, there's not really an awful lot to say about the Jordy figure that I haven't already said about the Riker figure. They're very similar, of course. The only thing that's really different is the colour of their costume and their head sculpts. Otherwise, these are pretty much the same figure. They both come with the same phaser accessory, and I think it's a shame that perhaps they couldn't have invented something bespoke for Jordy that would have been nice, or fresh. Perhaps a data pad, for example, or a tricorder would have been nice. Something like that, just to make the figure seem a little bit more distinctive when it came to the accessories. But nevertheless, a very solid figure, very welcome in the collection, and I think both of these figures are really nice actually, and I'm really glad to have them. And as I said at the top of the video, it's fantastic to see more of the bridge crew being represented for the next generation line. This is fantastic. We're about halfway there now. There's another few characters to go before it will feel properly done, but it's starting to fill up, which is fantastic. So hopefully by the end of this year or next year, we will have a full complement. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.